Hi guys, it's Marc Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Marc Zicree of Space Command, also known as Star Trek writer Marc Zicree, Twilight Zone writer Marc Zicree, etc., writer Marc Zicree, and all the stuff I'm talking about on Mr. Sci-Fi. But today we're going to talk about the real Star Trek Discovery, and let me explain myself. So, many of us have been watching Star Trek Discovery. I've been commenting on it extensively on Mr. Sci-Fi, and now we've watched the entire first season. And I won't go into too much in terms of spoilers, but let's say we dealt with the Klingon War, we dealt with the Mirror Universe, we saw twists and turns of who was who, etc. And then it led into the next season, which will be, we assume, an adventure with Captain Pike and presumably Mr. Spock on the Enterprise, interacting with the characters we've met on Star Trek Discovery. So that's all well and good. And, over the last few years, we've gotten Star Trek movies, J.J. Abrams' take on Star Trek. And, and people have had all numbers of opinions. Everyone seems to have their own opinion. Some people like J.J.'s Star Trek. Some people hate it. Some people like Star Trek Discovery. Some people hate it. But what people often are saying is, well, this doesn't feel like Star Trek. This isn't like the old shows, and wish we were doing something more like the old shows. Okay, so Star Trek Discovery is getting millions of views. It's a huge hit. They've renewed it for the second season, but there's another Star Trek Discovery, literally a discovery you can make about Star Trek, and for some of you it will be the Star Trek that you've been waiting for, hoping for, looking for, and for others it won't be your cup of tea. But I wanted to talk about it because many of you may not know about this, some of you may, but let's get into it. So, over the last 10 years or so, a little more than 10 years, there have been a number of fan groups that have been making their own Star Trek fan films. And I want to talk a little bit about the history of that and what these different groups have been doing and how it evolved. And I was part of it as well, and so we can talk about that. And yet, for some people who are Star Trek fans, this is a really fun group of stories to look at, and well worth your time and effort. And many of the Star Trek actors, the iconic Star Trek actors, are in them. So let me just go over all of this, and because also this is material that Paramount has largely shut down, so we will not be getting more episodes of these shows. They've basically been discontinued, but they're a very, very, very interesting iteration of Star Trek, and well worth checking out. So, let me give just a little background, a little history. Science fiction as a genre has often had what's called fan fiction, and many of the fan writers ultimately became professional writers. So Ray Bradbury, those kind of people, Frederick Pohl, they started as fans, became very well-known writers. Robert Heinlein was part of the fan community, etc. Many, Isaac Asimov, etc. And so there's always been this very interesting relationship between the official writing, the canon writing, the published writing, the broadcast writing, and what the fans were up to. And that's been from the beginning of the genre. So, for instance, Ray Bradbury was a huge fan of Edgar Rice Burroughs, and when he was 12 years old, he couldn't wait for the next John Carter of Mars novel to come out. So he sat down on a toy typewriter and wrote his own sequel. And that was the beginning of his writing career. And so it was a natural, and there were fanzines, which were fan magazines, often published initially on mimeograph, which was an old style of printing, and then Xerox and so forth. So there's been a long history of fans writing their own novels and short stories of their favorite characters and their favorite universes. And so it seemed only a natural evolution that when we got home video cameras or even Super 8 cameras, because when I was a 10-year-old kid, I was writing my own Star Trek script and shooting Super 8 home, movies and so forth as a precursor to the things I do now on a much larger scale. So it was a natural evolution, and Star Trek particularly lent itself to this because Star Trek, it was very clever when Gene Roddenberry came up with the original Star Trek. It had in the introduction, this is the 5-year mission of the Starship Enterprise, its journey, blah 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 blah, to go where no man has gone before, and but they didn't get 5 years; they got 3, and then the show was canceled and became a huge hit. And Star Trek: The Next Generation came about, and DS9, and therein hangs a tale. But from the very first, fans were making their own Star Trek films, and in fact, George Takei, way back when, I think even in the 70s, perhaps, he was part of a fan film that never got completed, but I've seen stills from it, and And then of course they did the Star Trek movies. So there was always, and then you had the Star Trek novels, and there was a big yin and yang of this, and a very strong identification between the fans and the shows, and the actors were going to conventions, and there was a real friendship and relationship between the fans and the actors, and Gene Roddenberry, and the writers, Dorothy Fontana, and George Clayton Johnson, and Theodore Sturgeon, and David Gerrold, and on and on and on, and so in recent years, as the home video equipment became more and more sophisticated, it became more and more possible for fans to make their own full episodes. And you started to have the Star Wars fan films too, and George Lucas approved of those, and even had an annual contest for the winners. And the only caveat was, or the only warning was, that you could not sell them. And that made sense, of course, because these were owned. Lucasfilm owned Star Wars, Paramount/CBS owned Star Trek. Star Trek originally aired on NBC, but it was made initially by Desilu. Then, second season, Paramount bought Desilu, so it was owned by Paramount. And then, when Viacom bought up both Paramount and CBS, the television rights to Star Trek went to CBS. The movie rights went to Paramount. So, for those of you who have been wondering how all this works, so there was a guy named James Colley, and he was... Now, meantime, there were certain Star Trek fan films set in the Star Trek universe, but not about the main characters, not about Kirk, Spock, McCoy, any of those characters. But the actors were getting older. The Star Trek movies had run their course. They'd become the Star Trek The Next Generation movies. So it's very clear that if anyone wanted to see further adventures with Sulu, Chekhov, Uhura, any of those characters, with those actors playing those roles, the networks and the studios clearly were not very interested in doing that. And JJ did bring back Leonard Nimoy for the Star Trek movie, but for most of the characters, they were not going to have further stories telling what happened to those characters, unless it would be actors playing new versions of them, as we've been seeing in the Star Trek movies, the recent ones, and of course now in the new Star Trek series. We assume it'll be a new actor playing Spock, or perhaps the actor who's been playing him in the movies. We'll find out, won't we? But there was the question of what to do with the iconic characters, what to do with Star Trek as we'd grown up watching it, particularly the classic Trek. So, and some fan films were being done of varying quality in the Star Trek universe, but not Star Trek, Kirk, Spock, McCoy Star Trek. So then James Colley, who was an Elvis impersonator by trade, but also he was very into costumes, and he had actually worked with William Ware Tice making costumes for Star Trek The Next Generation. And William Ware Tice was the great costume designer of the original Star Trek, a genius. And he had also worked on Star Trek The Next Generation, died fairly young. But James Colley got the blueprints of the original Star Trek sets. And in upstate New York, he had this brilliant idea, and he and various other fans started making full-size duplicates of the Star Trek sets. They're still up there in upstate New York. You can actually go to them now. They're a museum now. But he built full-size replicas of the original Star Trek sets, and together with Doug Drexler, who was working as a visual effects guy on Star Trek Voyager, on Deep Space Nine, on Enterprise, they started making their own Star Trek episodes as fan films, full-hour episodes. And where I heard about this first was I was on a Star Trek panel with Walter Koenig and some other people who'd worked on Star Trek, Ron Moore, and Walter was about to go star in one of these. And that night I watched one of their episodes online, and it was a sequel to The Doomsday Machine, which was one of the great episodes of Star Trek, the original Star Trek. And the idea, by the way, was that since the 5-year mission hadn't gotten concluded, the Star Trek New Voyages, which James Colley named it, would continue the 5-year mission. And ultimately Star Trek Voyages was renamed Star Trek Phase 2, because in the 70s they were going to bring Star Trek back as a TV show, and they spent a year developing it. Michael Reeves came up with this great Sulu episode that he and I ultimately ended up doing for Star Trek New Voyages. And after a year, Star Wars came out. Paramount decided to do the Star Trek movies instead. And so that year of development on Star Trek Phase 2, from 1976 to 77, they spent millions building sets, buying scripts, never got made. So James Colley starts shooting episodes using a cast. He's playing Kirk. He has fans basically playing Spock, McCoy, Chekhov, Scotty, all the main characters. But he's also bringing aboard actors who were on Star Trek. And initially, it's mainly guest stars, Malachi Throne and Barbara Luna and William Wyndham. And in the sequel to The Doomsday Machine, it was a wonderful episode. It was very, very fun. The effects were very good. The writing was fun. William Wyndham was terrific, and reprising the role of Deckard that he played in the original Doomsday Machine, which was... And so it was very... And it was coming from the right place, from a place of real affection. No one was earning a salary. No one was getting rich off this. It was just for fun and for love of Star Trek. And so I watched that, and I thought it was great. And then Walter Koenig went and shot an episode where he reprised reprised Chekhov, and D.C. Fontana, who story edited the original Star Trek and wrote some of the great episodes, Journey to Babel, many other wonderful episodes. She wrote this episode, with this Chekhov episode that the Star Trek New Voyages did, and it was really interesting and really fun. And millions of people around the world were watching these episodes online because the internet and home video and editing on a Mac, all of these things had emerged. So you could basically do a very high quality show of just, without being part of a studio, without being part of a network. So that's when I did the World Enough in Time with Michael Reeves, with Elaine. George Takei reprised the role of Sulu. It was nominated for the Hugo and Nebula. Christina Moses played his daughter. She's now starring in TV series, and you can see her on the originals and various other places. And again, millions of people saw it. And so ultimately, Star Trek New Voyages, which was then called Star Trek Phase 2, then back to Star Trek New Voyages, they did 11 episodes, ultimately. And I think there's a 12th in the works. But as I say, these have all been stopped now, so they've been allowed to complete what they had in the hopper. But at the same time, and some of these are of variable quality. Some are very, very good. Some are less good. But they attracted amazing talent. But and well worth watching. And again, you have to watch them with a grain of salt. You have to say, okay, some of the actors are not going to be professionals, but let's really look at this and see what it is and see where it's coming from. So at the same time, there was a guy named Vic Mignogna, and he was a voice actor for a lot of anime, and very popular. He'd go to conventions and do signings. And at first he was working with James Colley on Star Trek New Voyages, Star Trek Phase 2, but then he decided to branch off and start his own Star Trek show. And so he started one called Star Trek Continues, starring himself as Kirk. Now, James Colley had been playing Kirk and then ultimately replaced himself and cast another actor. Now, Vic Mignogna was playing Kirk. Now, one thing that was problematical, of course, was anyone who tries to imitate William Shatner, it's problematical because I've talked about Shatner as the greatest bad actor ever. And I say that as a compliment, because Shatner has these incredible mannerisms. He's very, very broad, very big as an actor, but wonderful. I love William Shatner. But anyone else who tries to do Shatner, it can seem like an imitation, a bad imitation rather than a performance. And so with James Colley, I was always working to get it to be a performance, and we succeeded, I think. And Vic Mignogna, the more he goes into performance rather than just doing an imitation of Shatner, the more I personally like it. But Star Trek Continues had a very high level of production. They got a lot of name actors. So whereas Star Trek New Voyages / Phase 2 had D.C. Fontana and David Gerrold shot an episode of his and directed it. He'd written Trouble with Tribbles on the original Star Trek. He'd been a writer on Star Trek The Next Generation. Walter Koenig, William Wyndham. Many of these people were working on Star Trek New Voyages. Vic Mignogna got James Doohan's son Chris to play Scotty. James Doohan had played Scotty in the original Star Trek. He got Michael Forrest, who had been a guest star on the original Star Trek. He got Lou Ferrigno, who played the Hulk. He got Gigi Edgley from Farscape, Marina Sirtis from Star Trek New Voyages, Cass Anvar, on and on. Many, John Delancey who played Q, Michael Dorn, who'd been on Star Trek The Next Generation, of course, and Deep Space Nine. So they got a high level of actors. Additionally, they got some very good writers, principal among them Robert Sawyer, who's a Hugo-winning science fiction novelist. And so they, too, were continuing the 5-year mission and doing a very good quality of episodes. So you can go on Star Trek New Voyages and watch their episodes. You can go on Star Trek Continues and watch their episodes. It's also on YouTube. So you can watch these things on a 55, 65-inch TV screen in stereo and high def. Looks great. Great visual effects, because again, the visual effects were being done by Emmy-winning visual effects guys, Darren Doctorman and Doug Drexler and Tobias Richter in Germany, really talented guys. So then, but the challenge was, and I knew this when I did World Enough in Time, the Sulu episode for Star Trek New Voyages, I knew that the higher profile these things got, the more we'd be in the crosshairs of Paramount. And so before I did World Enough in Time, by then JJ had announced he was going to do his movie. So I had lunch with JJ, who I knew, and I said, I'm going to do this thing with George Takei. Do you have any problem with it? And he said, no, I'm fine. So I knew that he wouldn't call business affairs and say, pull the plug on this thing, not knowing it was me. And so I was fine. But when they wanted me to do more of these episodes, I declined because I knew that the likelihood was strong that ultimately Paramount would step in and pull the plug on this. And because Paramount previously had a history of being extremely proprietary with Star Trek to a fault. For instance, they would go to conventions and tell people dressed in their own handmade Star Trek uniforms that they were violating copyright. And I think they pulled back on that when they realized how incredibly offensive it was. But because, again, science fiction has a relationship with the fans where, yes, Paramount is the copyright holder, but still you want the audience to invest in the project. You want them to go to conventions and dress up and all of that. And the more they're invested, the more they're going to be buying stuff. They're going to be buying toys and DVDs or Blu-rays or downloading it or whatever. It's they're paying for CBS All Access. So, okay, I don't think anyone who's a Star Trek fan would watch Star Trek Continues or Star Trek New Voyages and not go to the movies or not download Star Trek Discovery or whatever. But, okay, so here's what happened, because it's a fascinating story. And this is the true Star Trek Discovery. This is the 5-year mission of Star Trek that you can discover just by going online. And so, whereas we have this new Star Trek Discovery show, this is a separate Star Trek Discovery that you yourself can make. So, and it'll be very rewarding, because it takes you right up to the end of the 5-year mission that dovetails right into the first Star Trek the Motion Picture, and with Star Trek Continues, they end it with Kirk in his admiral's uniform from Star Trek the Motion Picture, so it goes right into that. It's a very fun timeline, and but meantime, there was a guy named Sky Conway. He was doing his own Star Trek content. At first, he did a 2-hour Star Trek movie called Of Gods and Men that had Nichelle Nichols playing Uhura again, which was quite wonderful. It had Walter Koenig. And then he did something called Star Trek Renegades. And that was a Star Trek show about these renegades who were, in the Star Trek universe. And that had Walter Koenig, had Tim Russ, who had been Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, had Sean Young from Blade Runner, had Robert Picardo, with whom I'm working on Space Command, and of course Robert Picardo was in Star Trek Voyager. And it was these were very entertaining. They weren't, again, of the quality of like a big $200 million movie, but entertaining and fun. And to see Nichelle Nichols playing Uhura again was just wonderful, or Walter Koenig playing Chekhov. These are people heading through their 70s and into their 80s. We're not going to have that opportunity, and clearly they're not going to be given lead roles again in Paramount movies or CBS TV shows. So this is their opportunity. It's almost like small town theater. And so this is something I very much applauded. But meantime, another Star Trek project started up called Axanar, and some of you know about this. And it was Alec Peters and Christian Gossett directed Prelude to Axanar. It was a prequel to Axanar, which was a 2-hour Star Trek movie that they were proposing, and through crowdfunding, and it had Richard Hatch starring in it, and J.J. Hertzler and Gary Graham, and it was it was very of a very high quality of visual effects, and the acting was professionals. It was actors from Battlestar Galactica and on, Star Trek, and you name it. But the problem was that Alec Peters was raising money to finance it, and he ended up raising over $1 million. Now, when I did the Star Trek episode with George Takei, Michael Reeves and Winston Engel and I worked up an entire Sulu series, a Bible, a 2-hour outline, and I went to CBS and I pitched it. But I realized that it was a long shot, because I spent decades working for the studios and the networks, and as a writer producer, and so I knew how they think. And if you're on the outside of that world, they didn't want to do a Sulu series. It was very obvious when I met with them. They were interested to hear what my take was, but when I was talking to Alec Peters before, when he was doing Axanar, when he was raising the money, and he was talking about that their hope was that it would be picked up as a series, that CBS would see the quality of it, I just knew that because he was outside the network world, that would be extremely unlikely, because they hire their own kind. They hire Brian Fuller. They're going to hire, the people that they're already working with, and that's just how it works. And they don't go outside their own little envelope, particularly with one of their big money-making franchises. So Axanar raised over $1 million, and Alec Peters was talking to the press about This was a professional shoot and not a fan film. And though sometimes he'd say it was a fan film because again, Paramount, the big eye of Paramount, like the big eye of Sauron, turned on him, and they sued him, and to stop him. And then they basically issued edicts to stop all the Star Trek fan films. Their edicts were you could only do 15-minute Star Trek fan films. You could have no one who had ever worked on Star Trek be in them, have anything to do with them, to work on them in any way. Now, I personally believe that if anyone ever challenged that in court, they'd win, because I don't think Paramount has a right to stop any actor or any writer or anyone from doing a Star Trek fan film because, it's just like restraint of trade. I don't know. It's like I never signed a thing saying I wouldn't do a fan film. So why would they? Someone who didn't work on Star Trek can do it, but I can't. Well, that's a little dubious. But I'm not planning to anyway. But they set rules on the Star Trek fan films where they can only be 15 minutes. They have to use approved Star Trek merchandise, all this stuff. I mean, yeah, I understand that some of the people in CBS Legal are Star Trek fans and fans of these fan films, but they did everything they could to basically kill them, quite honestly. And so Star Trek continues, but they did, fortunately, kindly enough, they said to Star Trek Continues and the various Star Trek projects, they said, look, you can finish what you've got, what you've already shot, you can finish post-production. So Star Trek Continues wrapped up, and Star Trek New Voyages wrapped up, and now they're, as I said, they've taken their sets and they're just going to be a museum, an attraction. And Renegades, what they've done is they've stripped out all their Star Trek content so they can continue shooting Renegades episodes, but it won't be in the Star Trek universe. And as for Axanar, Alec Peters is allowed to shoot a 30-minute conclusion that at least sends something to his backers, because he raised over $1 million, but he's got to raise more money to be able to finish that. So it's challenging and problematical in certain ways. And sadly, Richard Hatch died. He was going to play the Klingon villain. And if you watch Prelude to Axanar, which again is online, it looks great. He's great in it. And it's a shame that this will never get made. The 2 hours would have been great fun. But again, and some people say, well, Paramount has a right to do this. They own Star Trek. And that's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. And but I think, for me, I would have preferred, when I was doing the Star Trek episode with George Takei, which I'm very proud of. I think I'm prouder of that than anything else I've done in my career, frankly. I think it came out wonderfully. It's on Mr. Sci-Fi. You can just watch it. It's called Star Trek New Voyages, World Enough in Time. You can watch it in its entirety. I was approached by CBS and Paramount both to sell. They wanted to come aboard to sell it as DVD content, Blu-ray content, downloadable content. Sadly, it was executives in the hierarchy, but they could not convince the guy at the top, their boss at the top, who was not a Star Trek fan, to say yes. And so it didn't happen. But it really would have made much more sense for something like Star Trek Continues or any of these Star Trek films to just be downloadable content that people could have bought for 99 cents or $1.99. Paramount would have made millions of dollars with no out-of-pocket cost for them at all. It would have made a lot more sense. It would have, and no one would have confused J.J. Abrams' $200 million movie or Star Trek Discovery, which is $10 million an episode. Nobody would have been confused by who was doing what. They could have had a disclaimer at the front saying this is a fan project, not canon, just like the novels are not canon, just like the comic books are not canon. They are not the official timeline, the official story. Anyway, so, but the good part is that Star Trek Continues did 11 episodes, full hour episodes. Star Trek New Voyages / Phase 2 did 11 episodes. So together the two of them have done 22 episodes of the of the fourth and fifth year of Star Trek's 5-year mission. So we get to watch that with, George Takei, Walter Koenig, Nichelle Nichols, many of the top writers, top actors from the Star Trek world and beyond. It's I'm really glad that I got to be part of it. I'm really glad that all these other very talented men and women got to be part of it. I've watched a number of these shows and enjoyed them. I think they did a sequel on Star Trek Continues to Mirror Mirror. Mirror Mirror is one of my favorite Star Trek episodes from the original series. It was written by Jerome Bixby. It's the Mirror Universe, which we've seen in Star Trek Discovery. But if you want to see a really interesting take on the Star Trek Mirror Universe, watch the sequel that they did on Star Trek Continues. It's actually, Michael Reeves and I were approached to write that script, and that didn't happen, sadly. I would have enjoyed doing it, but the job they did was great anyway, and I really enjoyed watching that sequel. And so it's and also it's made me a number of new friends, a lot of people that I know now that I wouldn't have known otherwise, that I really have enjoyed getting to know, and I think I'll be working with a number of them in the future moving forward. And also what this created very powerfully, and this is the thing that also interests me a lot, is a lot of fans around the world learned that they could do professional quality material or material approaching professional quality using their Macs, using After Effects, using all sorts of CG programs, Maya and Lightwave and you name it, and Mocha, and that they could learn editing on a Mac or on a PC. They could send files back and forth from Germany to America to wherever, and you had thousands of people around the world making this content. The next obvious step, which I'm moving into, Space Command would not exist if I had not done World Enough in Time, because that showed me that the fans could help support us, both emotionally, financially, artistically, that the fan community is the same as the pro community in a way. The audience merges with the creators in a certain interesting way that science fiction allows us to have a community. And so many of the people who have been my fans become my collaborators. Many of the people who I've admired over the years become my collaborators. Doug Jones and Robert Picardo and Mira Furlan and Bill Mumy and all these great, wonderful actors. James Hong, for God's sake, to have him in Space Command has been wonderful. So Space Command is my continuing journey into this kind of hopeful future that Star Trek created for me. But again, the real Star Trek discovery is these shows. So I urge you to watch them. Star Trek Continues, Star Trek New Voyages, Phase 2 of Gods and Men, Renegades, Axanar. You can find all of it online, and it's literally dozens of hours of entertainment. And some of the performances you'll say, well, they tried to do Scotty, but they didn't pull it off. Or they tried to do Sulu, and they didn't pull it off. I'm talking about the actors other than George. George Takei does Sulu great, and I really like Chris Doohan's tribute to his father when he does Scotty as well. And but it's really an amazing time. I'm glad that people can do these projects, and and we'll see where it all leads. But I think a lot of these fan groups, what they should start doing, frankly, is their own original science fiction content. Or here's another cool idea that I would strongly urge these fans to look at: many, many, many famous science fiction novels and novelists. Would love to see their work shot. Hollywood has just chewed them up and spit them out. Even when Hollywood has been interested, it's gone into development, or it comes out and it's a shitty movie or a terrible TV show. So to all of you fans out there, maybe some of you have worked on some of these Star Trek iterations or Star Wars fan films. Start looking at books by Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Robert Heinlein, or some of the writers who are around now. Don't shoot these things without permission, but go to science fiction conventions, meet these writers, the ones who are still alive, talk to them. If there's a short story you love or a novel you love, say, look, here's some footage of something I shot. I'd love to shoot something of yours. You can get into those conversations. And I think the next coming thing will be a huge, amazing science fiction series that marries the fan world and the pro world. And, Space Command is also something you can all check out. It's definitely been an evolution from what I've been doing, marrying those two worlds. And we'll see where it leads. But now I'm pitching the show, but we are actively in post-production. And our fans have been, I've raised hundreds of thousands on Kickstarter, and fans have been buying investment shares, $7,500. People still around the world are buying shares in Space Command, and we're actively pitching it now to networks and platforms. We'll see where it all leads. We're going to be showing the first half hour completed at Comic-Con, and then we're going to be showing the first hour. We're talking about showing the first hour at the C21 Drama Summit in London in the fall. And we're finishing the first 2 hours, continuing forward. We have 40 minutes edited on the second 2 hours, and I shot the opening sequence of the third 2-hour story. It's a 12-hour season. And so just as Star Trek Continues did 11 episodes, Star Trek New Voyages did 11, I'm going to do 12 on Space Command on Season 1. I've written 8 hours of it. I'm going to be writing all 12. And we'll see where that leads. But I'm so grateful to James Colley. Again, I just want to say this, because people don't say it enough. Some people love James Colley. Some people have, their challenges with James Colley. And it's the fan community, everyone has their opinion. Some people have more than one opinion on a given subject. But James Colley and Doug Drexler had the brilliant, crazy idea of building the Star Trek sets and doing their own Star Trek episodes with Kirk, Spock, McCoy. And I got to tell you, writing those characters was such a dream come true for me. Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Uhura, Sulu, Chekhov. It was wonderful. And if not for James Colley and Doug Drexler and all the people who made that happen, Star Trek New Voyages, you wouldn't have had Star Trek Continues or any of these other things. It's sometimes it takes someone way outside the box to come up with something that just inspires everyone and moves everyone. And then we go back to Gene Roddenberry, who came up with this amazing idea way back when that spawned billions of dollars in revenue and made a wonderful dream for millions, if not billions, of people around the world. So that's it for now. Marc Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, but check these things out. I think you'll enjoy them, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.